Welcome to this session on measuring consumption and inflation during the pandemic. Our first speaker is Rachel Soloveichik from the Bureau of Economic Analysis in Washington, D.C. And Rachel, if you'd be kind enough to begin now, you'll have about 20 minutes.
Okay, I hope people can see and hear me, and I'm going to try sharing my screen. If I don't see anything, I'm going to assume that people can see stuff. So thank you so much for coming, and this is a paper where the title has changed, but the basic idea is remaining the same as before. And this is a very theoretical paper, so none of the stuff I'm talking about is really going to be addressing directly the practical measurement problems that so many other people have studied. And so here's just a preview of the theoretical strategy. These are pictures I got online, nothing sophisticated, but just people like going to dense urban regions, even though they're much more expensive. And so given the tourists have to, you know, have a fixed budget and they want to get the maximum utility they can, it's hard to explain why they pay higher prices for the observable goods. And what I'm going to say is that the implicit price for the goods that just aren't available in rural areas can be used as a general proxy for the implicit price of all the things that aren't available during a shutdown. So this is a heroic assumption that basically people's normal tourist behavior is a proxy for how people also respond, you know, to shutdowns. And I'm just focusing on Louisiana mostly because I can get some great pictures, but you can find that in almost every region you look at. People go to expensive regions even though, you know, they have to pay more. And so just to preview the empirical results, unsurprisingly, you're going to find that product availability started dropping in March, bottomed out in April, and then has been slowly recovering. And this is United States. Other countries, of course, have different, you know, recovery patterns. And so once I adjust for the fact that all these products were not available, and so their implicit price is much higher, then theoretical inflation is going to be at least 1.2 percentage points above the CPI and 4.9 percentage points above the CPI in Q2. And this is about a third of the drop in nominal consumption is about double that. So we're going to miss approximately 1/3 of the theoretical drop in real consumption. In other words, the published statistics show sort of how much do people spend on the producer side, but we're measuring how much would people accept reduced spending if they can have a better choice of what goods they're allowed to buy. And then I have two data appendixes if anybody's interested in like studying specific products or specific regions. And all of my stuff is based on publicly available data so people can play with the assumptions as they please. And so just the outline of the presentation, I'll have a brief review of the price measurement literature. And that literature, you know, has been studying this type of problem for a long time, though fortunately it has not yet had to address something as dramatic as the pandemic until now. Hopefully this pandemic will not happen again, so we won't need to have, you know, this type of research as a regular thing. Then I'm going to develop a new model to estimate theoretical prices for unavailable products. I'm going to briefly talk about empirical data under the exact unavailable products. And just to be clear, I'm not getting involved in whether it was a government order, whether it was fear of infection, whether it was fear of liability. They're all sort of the same from the point of view of somebody who was having a normal consumer spending pattern in 2019 and now has to, you know, dramatically change. And then I'm going to show regional estimates of product unavailability. And we can then get regional inflation rates because at least in the United States, there's huge regional differences in how stay-in-place policies have been implemented and how people have responded to the pandemic. And so this is just a theoretical measurement problem. I'm going to talk about a Lasperis price index because that's the easiest one to analyze. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the basic formula. And of course, this formula just doesn't solve if you don't have prices to put in it. And the CPI, they're long have addressed this problem, and they make a general assumption that, you know, prices of a good with missing data are similar to prices with reliable data. And that's a very reasonable assumption when you're dealing with, okay, they have apple cinnamon Cheerios, but not Cocoa Crispy cereal or something like that, where it's just random noise in the data. Maybe it's out of stock in one store, or maybe people don't like apple cinnamon Cheerios this month. And people have tested it, it's fine normally, but it's just that assumption doesn't apply when you have a broad category of in-person restaurants, museums, that are all unavailable. And so you have to reach and find a very dissimilar good that you're going to be using as a proxy. And it's just not clear that the good you're using is a close substitute. And so we have to rely on economic theory to do, how we should impute prices. Unfortunately, there's this grand price literature studying this type of problem. The most directly related is new goods, where they're sort of studying the symmetric problem. A product isn't available in the first period, but it is available in the second period. And so we want to calculate the gains from the newly available product. And if price indexes are symmetric, then Lasper's problem for us now is exactly the same as the Haas problem for the new goods. You also have outlet substitution bias. This is kind of when you're studying, you used to have to go to a butcher shop to buy meat. Now you can get it at Walmart. How to address the fact that the meat is cheaper at Walmart. And this could be used to address the fact that some goods that people can't buy in person, they can still buy online. And so there's been a lot of substitution for certain highly commoditized goods that people are starting to buy online a lot more. But unfortunately, it doesn't help with services, which are, where most of the unavailable spending is. And then finally, we have variety bias literature. And this literature has some very specific functional forms, and it can analyze the impact of a slight variety change, like adding strawberry yogurt to when you had vanilla yogurt before. But it's not clear it can really be scaled up to add, entire different product categories. But these all have, useful things to think about. And there's also, of course, other literature that's more indirectly related. And there's, as I said, the literature on how to measure the consumption basket, how to measure prices, those are very important literatures, but they're not directly related to the theoretical problem. All of my research assumes that, we got perfect data on the prices and weights for each commodity. It's just the problem that some prices just don't exist because the products are not available. So I have a new price measurement model, and I'm starting with a world in which tourists are choosing a rural or urban vacation. And there are 6 products: housing, which in this case is a hotel room, goods 1 and 2, and services 1 and 2, and the amenity. And the amenity might be something like museums or, live sporting events or things that are only available in dense urban regions. And so my basic assumption is rational tourists visit the region where the vacation budget buys the most utility. And this works best when I'm analyzing close urban and rural locations. So the weather is very similar, travel costs are very similar. It's really a case, do you turn left at the fork or right at the fork to go into the city or out of the city? And so if the tourists are rational, they're going to pick a spot where they can get the most utility for a vacation budget, which is equivalent to saying where the total prices for the vacation are lowest. And so you can just work that through the price equation, and you get a price premium for the unavailable rural amenity. How much would somebody going to the rural area pay in order to get this urban amenity so they could have the cheap hotel rooms plus the fun of going to, a Broadway play? And, you just solve it for all the other things and you get, an imputed price. And that looks complicated, but all of those numbers we can get because BA has a travel and tourism satellite account, and it has price indexes for specific products. So we can just put it in, an Excel spreadsheet, and it solves nicely. And so this is a critical assumption in the paper. So I'm assuming that whatever the premium tourists were willing to pay for something like Broadway plays that are unavailable in rural areas, people in a shutdown would have been willing to pay the same amount for the unavailable stuff. So for example, a Broadway play, the tourist would have paid a premium for the Broadway play if he could have gotten it when he was vacationing in the mountains. And the same way, somebody in New York City who can't go to the Broadway play because it's unavailable will also pay a premium. And if anything, I think this is a lower bound because a lot of the stuff that's unavailable during, you know, the coronavirus is more necessary than the luxury amenities that tourists like. And some stuff people don't even think of as really discretionary, like clothing. It's very inconvenient for people not to buy any in-person clothing. And the fact that it's available around the country in normal times suggests that people do think it's a very valuable amenity. And so what we get is you can just put it through and you can get theoretical prices. This is what, you know, you would get if you just calculated, you know, according to the theory. And then you have quasi-BLS prices where I don't know BLS's actual methodology for imputing prices, and that would be a lot of work to reconstruct. So I'm just, here is in my simple model where there's only, you know, these six good products to study. Here's what the BLS price index would predict. And so I'm just saying the price for the available good is used as a proxy for the price for the available unavailable good. The price for the available service is used as a proxy for the unavailable service. And then the amenity is just dropped because there's nothing that's a direct proxy. And so what we got is, this is actually very easy to calculate because BEA's regional income account, it gives us price indexes for housing, price indexes for goods, and price indexes for services in every region of the country. And the travel and tourism account gives the spending share for tourists. And what, if you look at it, tourists spend a much larger share of their consumption basket on the fun amenities, which isn't surprising. And so you can't just use direct tourists. What you have to do is calculate an imputed price for unavailable stuff and then apply it to what BA's regional spending account. And so what I calculate is that imputed prices for the unavailable products are at least 59% above their normal prices. In other words, people would, on average, pay a 59% premium to buy stuff that they can't buy now. And this isn't like any specific good has that exact price premium. It's sort of the broad range, and that should be about average. And so what you do is then you just put it in the equations, and then you get the theoretical prices. In practice, the BLS inflation rates are so low that it doesn't really matter, you know, how you weight the available data. It really matters what share of the consumption basket is unavailable. And if you look at Appendix A, you can see how I calculated that. You can play with the numbers and get higher or lower shares of unavailability for products. A lot of it has to do with things that people could buy but are scared to buy, and whether that should be, and how to handle that. And then Appendix B, which I'm going to talk about, reports actual product unavailability for every region. And so you can just multiply what's the actual product availability times what the inflation rate would be if there was a full stay-in-place policy. And here is my basic result. If you have a full stay-in-place policy, then you get inflation of about 15% from just the stay-in-place policy. This is not anything related to, you know, the prices for available goods changing. This is just how much would people pay in order to get access to their normal bundle of goods. And so what you actually find, at least in the United States, was there wasn't that much unavailability in March. It was quite high in April and has been slowly going down since. And so inflation was highest in April and has been actually negative in May and June. And this paper just combines these into Q1 and Q2 because that's how BA publishes our economic statistics. So just the next part is how do I calculate actual product unavailability? And the main result is taken from Google's mobility trends, which is great data. Anybody can download it. It's fun to play with. And I'm going to focus on the retail and recreational locations because that's where sort of the products tend to be bought and sold. And the data set is publicly available at the Dade County level, though I'm going to aggregate it up to BEA regions. And I did a little bit of imputing because sometimes I have data for one mobility category but not the other. So I sort of use the mobility changes I see to impute the ones I don't. And then I combine with the American Time Use Survey, which gives normal mobility levels. And so what I see is mobility has sort of very specific patterns. In cities, it tends to be highest in on the weekends, actually, in the rural areas, it's highest on Saturdays, but Sundays is a low mobility day. And so we're just going to adjust for that type of thing in order to get a better picture of what is, the mobility changes. You have a base level, and then you have the mobility changes. And then finally, what I have is weather data that Google they compare, all their numbers are compared to a day in January. And this can be misleading if January had very different weather than May. And I'll show later on that the weather does really influence mobility around, in retail and recreational locations, even though most of them are indoors. It still has a big influence. And so if you just look at raw mobility changes alone, you wouldn't get the full picture of how regional differences in the United States have evolved. And so here are just some pretty pictures. This is made with Microsoft Excel graphs. The black spots are counties that refuse to map for some reason. So this is just normal. If you look closely, you can see the cities are darker, which means that they normally have more time spent at retail and recreational cities, and very poor areas tend to be lighter. And this is just the baseline. So the cities started out by having more to lose. And now here's March, and this is the beginning of the shutdown, and here's April, where it's at its peak. And if you see, now there's almost no differences across the country in mobility. If anything, the rural areas are a little more mobile. And so what I'm going to say is you have a lot more product availability differences in the cities, and so they suffered higher, they suffered more from the coronavirus pandemic. Whether that was, different government policies or different fears of infection, doesn't matter, but they really did have a larger shutdown. And this is same thing for May. It's gradually recovering, and you can see that it's recovering faster in the rural areas. But these are all unadjusted. And so what I want to just go next is just show you the impact of temperature. None of this is surprising. That people like leaving the house more as it gets warmer until around about 80 degrees of the average temperature, and then it just goes way down. Maybe you'd find different results in another country where people are, less scared of the heat, but in the United States, we don't like heat very much. And these are estimated from the whole sample, but you get very similar results if I just start out with before March 15th. So I get, before coronavirus, this is just a basic human nature thing. Same thing with humidity. Humidity doesn't change much about behavior until you get to pretty sticky, and then it goes down fast. So it's super hot and humid. People don't like leaving the house. And so what you can do is just put this into the adjustment for every weather pattern you see. And so what you're going to find is that this is March. Doesn't really change much across the whole country. You have, pretty much the same mobility. But as you go down to April, May, and finally June, what you get is in the South, the weather is getting worse. Around January, it was actually pleasantly warm and not too humid. But then by June, it's getting just really unpleasant to be outside. And so people are staying inside just partly because of the weather. Whereas if you go further north, it's getting nice. In January, it was super cold and people didn't want to leave the house, but now it's perfect weather. And so once you adjust for all this, you actually get an even larger difference between the South and the North in the United States. The South, part of the reason they look like they're social distancing is because they're not even going outside their house because it's humid. But New York City and all the northern areas, they're social distancing extra to make up for the heat. And so what you just do is you put it in and you could just get how to value this in terms of absolute numbers. So the ATUS respondents, they normally spend about 75 minutes per day at retail and recreational locations. And it's not obvious exactly what they're doing. Some of it's essential, like medical visits, but about 75% of the time is spent on things that we would classify as non-essential: in-person dining, in-person shopping, not for groceries or gasoline. And so almost every region sees a mobility drop. And so what you get is adjusted time, fell 13 minutes per day in March. And of course, that's much larger if you focus on the second half of March when all the coronavirus restrictions were starting to be implemented. 33 minutes per day in April, 23 minutes per day in May, and 15 minutes per day in June. So there is a very much return to normal. And so we can just put that in. And so 13 minutes per day over 75 minutes, and then 75 minutes times 75%, just multiply it through, and then you get theoretical inflation. And the paper gives the exact formulas. And so also wealthy urban areas saw larger mobility drops. And this is just, a graph from 2018. This is theoretical income per capita in 2018. And then we have the theoretical inflation in Q2. And you can see the really big circle on the top is New York City. But if you take out New York City, it doesn't change it. That you have just the wealthy areas stop moving more. At this point, it's not clear whether it was that mobility restrictions are a luxury good, and so people who can afford to buy more safety do so, or whether it's that people just in those areas are more concerned about coronavirus. And it works the same if you do real income per capita in 2018. And so there may be some inequality effects that the wealthy areas have the largest real consumption drops, then 2020 may turn out to be more equal than most other years. But this is something that needs to be studied because we don't yet see income for each region in 2020. And I can't even see the consumption drops in the second half of 2020. So just to conclude, so theoretical inflation is underestimated when many common goods and services are unavailable. And these are not just like you have to buy strawberry yogurt when you want a blueberry yogurt. These are major things that people have been consuming for centuries and are used to having in their consumption basket. And so the paper develops a new model to estimate theoretical cost of living. And the nice thing about this model is it's relatively easy to implement for any place where you have regional data and mobility and regional data on product unavailability. Then I have the detailed data that can be shared, and people who want to have different assumptions are I'm happy if they take my appendix data and just sort of put in their own assumptions. And what I find is we're missing a lot of theoretical drop in real living standards. And so the coronavirus pandemic has had a worse impact on, the standard of living than this conventional economic measures show. And of course, I haven't even studied any health impacts at all. So thank you for letting me talk. I'm going to pause a little early, that I hope people haven't, had questions they wanted to ask. I'll look in the Q&A now. No Q&A.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Yes, I've been following the Q&A, and I let you go on another minute or two since there was nothing in there. I'll ask people if they do have questions to type them in now, and if not, I have a question that I'll ask, but I'll wait and see whether others have questions first. So I'm still not seeing anything. So I'm just going to ask you a quick question then, if I may, Rachel. So this is very interesting, and I'm wondering whether, given this product unavailability as a result of the mobility restrictions and so on, whether you've thought about measuring welfare loss or even selective welfare loss for categories of goods.
I think of inflation as sort of one measure of welfare loss. I'm very reluctant to talk about welfare because I'm sort of studying the component of welfare that can be purchased by, going to the market and getting goods and services. Rules like you can't have, more than 10 people in a room. Those are not really market activities, so that's beyond the scope of my paper.
Thanks, and I see that there is a question now. Emily, would you be kind enough to unmute Anya so she can ask the question?
Can you hear me, or is that
yes.
fine? Okay, so I think this is all very interesting. It's very interesting to see, but I was thinking that when you don't have a good available, so you're saying that, it has a price for that. I'm wondering if the statistical offices now, they should just remove that good from the basket. So why do you think you should have a different price instead of doing this kind of easy way to go? Your
intuition is entirely reasonable. That's how the Bureau of Labor Statistics implicitly calculates inflation in the United States. And I think that's how most other statistical agencies do that around the world. I'm arguing a more theoretical point, that if this good really hadn't changed in price, then people would still be buying it. So we need to impute a higher price to match the fact that people aren't buying it now. So I'm trying to measure sort of how much does the cost of buying a fixed amount of utility go up when you can't buy your normal consumption basket.
I can see the amazing implications that it has for us to measure, say, some real measure of income, for example, right? Because what that means is that people are getting poorer in that sense.
Yeah, they're getting poorer, but I'm not really studying income because a lot of people are saving their income because all the ways they used to spend it are restricted. So how exactly you handle income when it's being saved and what the flavor you use is a complicated point that's beyond the scope of my paper. I'm really studying just consumption in the short term.
Okay, it's very interesting.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody. There are no more questions on the screen. And so I think that we will pass right away to Alberto Cavallo, the second speaker from Harvard University. And if you could unmute yourself, perfect. Thank you. And I will disappear again until it's time for the questions.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to follow up. I thought Rich's paper was fantastic, and it's sort of very complementary to what I'm going to show you now. I'm going to be doing an analysis on what has been the impact of the COVID crisis on the composition of spending and how that could potentially affect the inflation measurement from a practical perspective. So, the motivation is straightforward. The CPI measures a fixed basket of goods and services over time, and this basket is typically updated by most statistical agencies once a year, often with data that has been collected by expenditure surveys with a significant lag, usually 1 or 2 additional years. Now, in the US in particular, the baskets were updated, the weights were updated in December 2019, with data collected in 2017 and 18. And this is perfectly reasonable, probably in normal times. I just want to be clear, but there's growing awareness that it could severely bias our measurement of inflation, if you will, the cost of living, during crises like this, where there are restrictions on people's abilities to go and consume certain goods, even if they were to be available. And there's more theoretical work on this done by Erwin Dewart and Kevin Fox that you see listed there. But there's also been awareness among central bankers worried about the implications for the statistics they see. So I listed a couple here, Silvana Tenreiro at the UK and also Lane in Canada. You can find speeches where they've raised this as a potential issue. So what I wanted to do in the paper is actually calculate how much of an impact this is quantitatively having. And just to give you a sense of the results, I find in the US that a COVID adjusted basket produces an inflation rate using official data only of the subsectors, which is higher than what the aggregate CPI shows. By May of this year, the impact was particularly strong in the beginning of the pandemic. By May, there was nearly, almost 1% more inflation than what was being measured by the CPI. Still at, I would say, relatively low levels, but it suggests that inflation was actually higher. The reason that it was is that people are basically consuming a lot more food in this time period, particularly at home, which is this is a sector that's actually we're seeing more inflation in the US and other countries, positive inflation, just to be clear. And then they are consuming a lot less transportation and recreation, which are the big sectors that had this deflation at the beginning of the crisis in particular, and were driving many of the aggregate results, because usually it's a sector that tends to get weighted quite a lot in these indices. Now there's a corollary to this, is that traditionally low-income households are the ones that spend relatively more on food and less on transportation, just a matter of the composition of their basket. So it means that COVID inflation is actually highest for these low-income households. And I'm going to show you some results that differentiate across income patterns. And then I also find that similar results if I just focus on core. So this is not just about food and energy. There are some sectors within transportation that are non-energy and they actually have less weight in the COVID consumption basket. And they're the ones experiencing deflation. So it turns out, even if you do this for core, you find higher numbers with a COVID adjusted basket. I expanded this to other countries and I find similar results in 12 of those 17 countries I looked at. And here the key is to understand that the direction of this sort of bias in the CPI during the crisis that I'm identifying depends not only on the weights of the basket, because I'm making those changes very similar across countries, but more what's happening at the sector level. We need both components for the results of higher COVID inflation to hold. And some countries do not have that. And then I thinking more forward, what does this mean and implications? I think this divergence in sectoral inflation rates, which I'm sort of highlighting as a particular condition that is required to have this higher COVID inflation, suggests some sectors are being affected by supply shocks, which is a particular characteristic of this crisis compared to more demand-driven type of negative demand shocks we have seen in previous crises. So I just want to emphasize this is, I think, very strong suggestive evidence that supply shocks are playing a very important role. Okay, so let me go through the results. First, how are consumption patterns in the US changing? This is actually publicly available information collected by private firms, not me, from credit and debit card transactions. You can go to this website called tracktherecovery.org. This is a project, an academic project called Opportunity Insights. Some colleagues here at Harvard and Brown University have put together, where they reach these agreements with private firms that have these data sets, and then they sort of manipulate the data sets and produce statistics that are useful to track what is going on during COVID. And one of those alliances that they have is with this company that classifies credit and debit card transactions in the US over time according to these sectors that you see listed here. So the Opportunity Insights group has actually produced a sort of a cumulative expenditure index that you see here, and you can see how spending has changed over time relative to the pre-pandemic levels. And if you look at these lines, it's very clear most of these sectors experience a dramatic decline in consumption, nearly 70% for transportation and recreation, and then gradually we have seen those recovering over time. Now I will emphasize, if you look at this particular data, these are the two sectors that seem to be increasing here. These are apparel and healthcare spending. There are other sectors that remain quite low, which are transportation and recreation. We haven't seen yet too much of a recovery on that front. Now the only sector where we actually do not see a decline in spending is the blue line here, which is groceries. You can think of it as food. We have this spike at the beginning of the crisis, this panic buying and people trying to stock up, which goes away. But then the level here is remained above previous levels by roughly 10 to 15% over time. And still that is the case today. So there's more spending on food and less spending in nearly every other category, particularly transportation and recreation, which are going to be very important for my results. I should point out there are similar patterns in other data sets. The BEA produces great information also that roughly matches some of these patterns. And others have looked at this in other countries as well. And typically the story is sort of similar. There's more weight or spending on food and a lot less on other sectors that are slowly recovering. So those are the patterns. What I ask in the paper is, how is this affecting the CPI weights? The first thing I have to do is match some categories in this data relative to the CPI. I'm just showing you here, the matching is actually pretty good. There are some assumptions I have to make. But everything I see in groceries, I assume that's going to be a change in how much we spend in food and alcoholic beverages. Then the other sectors line up straight away. The only assumptions I've had to make is what happens with housing and recreation, where I don't, sorry, not recreation, housing and education, where I don't really have any information about spending patterns. So I'm simply assuming that they haven't changed, which I think is a fair assumption to make, at least for the first few months of the pandemic. Even though quality may have decreased in education, my students tell me that all the time, we may not have changed how much we pay of tuition. So I'm making that assumption. That's the only one I'm making. So I recalculate, I take these patterns, recalculate CPI weights, and you're seeing them here expressed as a share of the total over time. It turns out, you know, in the CPI basket, the biggest weight is housing, which actually becomes more important in my basket here, because I'm assuming expenditure there does not change, but then I have a decline in the total spending of the basket. So in relative terms, it becomes more important. Now it will turn out this is not really so important for the results, because there's been very little movement in housing prices in the US so far. If that changes, things may have a big impact. No? But what matters is what you see happening here with food, and in particular what happens here with transportation. Those are the sectors that are going to really matter in my calculations. And just to illustrate that, I'm showing you here what happened on a single month, April of 2020. You have all the CPI categories, subcategories that compose the headline CPI in the US. You have the monthly inflation rates in those categories from the official data. And then you have the set of weights in the official basket and the COVID CPI basket. And in the last two columns, I'm putting the incidence, which is the weight times the monthly inflation rate. So you can see what really seems to be driving the effect. And there are two things here. One is that we have these changes in weights. We have more importance in the consumption basket of food, and we have this huge decline in the weight of transportation that you see there. But that's part of the story. The other part of the story is we have this divergence in inflation rates. We are spending more in food, which is experiencing significantly more inflation, particularly in this month was a lot more. And then we're consuming less on transportation and recreation, which are sectors experiencing significant deflation. And you can see here in the incidence numbers to the right, that is having a big impact overall. So I can put all this together and recalculate the headline CPI in the US using the subsector CPI and the new weights. And if you focus for a second on the monthly inflation rates, you'll see there's not a big difference in February because consumption patterns were still very similar. But already by March, the COVID CPI I've constructed, it has less than half the deflation than what we saw in March. And then in April, the difference becomes greatest between the two. The COVID CPI was actually starting to rebound, so we had less deflation than the previous month, but there was a big collapse in the CPI official basket. And then in May, we experienced also a difference. Already the COVID CPI was in positive territory and the CPI was still showing a little bit of deflation. Now you put all this together, and by May, it meant that we have about 0.8% more inflation in the COVID CPI than what was measured by the official numbers. As I mentioned, this also happens in core. If you strip away food, you strip away the energy, you get similar results, at least qualitatively. They're quantitatively smaller over time because we don't have this impact of food in particular and the gas prices. But still, if you look at the total effect by May, the annual inflation rate of the COVID core was around 1.6 relative to 1.2, which for levels that we normally see of the core in the US, it's pretty high. And the intuition, as I mentioned before, is that there's less weight on some non-energy transportation sectors that are actually experiencing deflation during this time period. So let's go into the income levels. There are not any official indices that compute, low income and high income inflation in the US, but you can use the CX survey, as several papers have done in the past, to try to build your own weights. And that's what I did. I took the latest one that is available. I matched the categories, and then I tried to calculate weights for low income and high income quintiles of the income distribution. And you get what you would expect. You get that low income people spend more on food at home than high income people, and they spend significantly less on transportation than high income people. So I take these initial levels, and then I'm going to update them over time with data that Opportunity Insights gave me. Unfortunately, this is not publicly available, but they gave me sort of the same statistics, but now differentiating between the lowest quintile and the highest quintiles of income. And you have the patterns there. I will say, if you look at this and compare them, what is striking, and they point out in one of their papers on this, is that low-income household spending has actually recovered faster, and this is probably due to the fiscal measures that or relief measures that the US government has implemented. But the patterns other than that, they sort of have this similar structure, let's say, across groups. Now, it turns out when you recalculate then the inflation by income levels, what you get is the graph that I'm showing you here. The blue lines are essentially what I showed you in a table before, the sort of average consumer CPI down here near 0%, and then the adjusted by COVID basket being nearly 1% higher. But then if you split it out and you compare it to low and high income, it turns out it's the low income consumers, the ones that are experiencing the highest inflation during COVID. And I will say this is it has a lot more to do with the fact that they traditionally spend more on food and less on transportation, not necessarily the changes we have seen in their baskets in relative terms during COVID. But it is still affecting them nevertheless. And finally, I tried to do this in several countries. I do not have consumption patterns in other countries. So what I did is I took the official CPI weights, and I'm assuming and running the exercise, what happens if I assume the basket in relative terms across sectors has changed the same way as what I see in the US. And these are the results. You're looking at the results I get in different countries in terms of annual inflation rates. All the countries on the top, around 12 or 13 out of the 17, are countries where I get the similar result as the US. I get higher COVID inflation than normal CPI. Some of the differences, though, are probably at this stage negligible in terms of magnitude. And there's a subset of countries that you see listed here at the bottom where I actually get the opposite result. In those countries, I actually get that there's less COVID inflation. And the reason for this, and I am using these results to emphasize, is that the direction of this bias I am identifying depends not only on the weights and what I do with the composition of the basket, but also what is happening with those sectoral inflation rates. And there are some countries where this divergence between food and transportation doesn't really happen so clearly, or there's some other sector experiencing some change, and we're putting more or less weight on it, and it affects the results. So just to illustrate that, imagine we look at Brazil. You can look at this table for all the countries in the appendix. If I showed you the same table I was showing you before for all the categories and the weights, you can see in Brazil, the story is very similar to the US. There's a lot more weight on food, and it's a sector that's experiencing positive inflation. So it has a bigger impact incidence with COVID than with just the regular CPI basket. And you have this big decline in transportation weight for a deflationary sector. So it's sort of the same story. All the other countries seem to have this. There are others where I get less COVID inflation. And as I was saying, that has to do sometimes with what happens with food and transportation, but often there's some particular sector that is experiencing some strange or unique behavior. For example, in the case of Germany, there was inflation in recreation and electronics, this 900 COE category, and I'm placing less weight on it. So in the COVID CPI, the Germany has less inflation overall. I haven't looked into the reasons for some of these patterns. It was not the objective of the paper. I suspect in the case of Germany, it may have something to do with packaged holidays, which usually is a big component of the volatility we see in these categories. But the point I want you to remember is that it also depends on what happens at those sectors. So we should see how this plays out moving forward. On that note, I've also understand that what I'm highlighting in the paper, which has results until May, is something that may change, even if consumption patterns, consumption patterns for sure will gradually adjust. They may take a while, but even if they take long and we see those being quite persistent, this divergence in food and transportation inflation may not continue all the time, and it will affect the dynamics of COVID inflation. So what I'm doing is I'm updating this on a sort of live basis. If you want, as soon as the numbers of the BLS come out, I can pull the Opportunity Insights data and update them, and you can see these results on this website. Unfortunately, I do not get the low and high income expenditure changes all the time, so I'm not able to update those so quickly. But if you look at the numbers, there's been this big divergence that was created roughly towards May. The difference has been getting smaller, but still it remains of more than one, I think it's 0.6% by, if you take the numbers of August. No? And I'm making that clear with this slide. If you look at the last 3 months, in fact, these are the monthly inflation rate of the COVID in red and the official data in blue. You see that during the first 3 months of the pandemic, there's this great under estimate of inflation in the CPI, and it's actually turned around. There's now, if you will, an upward bias for not taking into account consumption changes. And this, intuitively, this is because gas prices have been rebounding, but really expenditure levels on transportation are still relatively down. So the CPI, it's overestimating inflation. The truth is, however, if you take these 3 months, the magnitude of the change has not been large enough to affect what we saw in the first 3 months of the year. So annual inflation rate, which you have here on the right, there's still a big gap in COVID inflation remains higher now. So let me conclude with some implications, and then I'm happy to take questions and talk more about any of these issues. First, I think my results show that the cost of living, as many sort of suspected and discussed, has risen faster than the CPI suggests during this period of the pandemic, particularly because there's been this shift towards consuming more food and a lot less transportation. And in times like this, particularly if you want to get the diagnosis right or what's going on right now in different sectors as well, it's important to be able to adjust that basket. And it affects low-income households more because they traditionally consume more food. So, people are losing their jobs, but they're also not experiencing a deflation that may help them in real terms. I also want to emphasize that the bias depends on the weights and the divergence in sectoral inflation rates, which I've sort of alluded to already. Some of these may be temporary, some of it may be more permanent. In any case, if it's a permanent change in weight, eventually the CPI will incorporate this. I'm more interested looking forward in understanding what drives this divergence in sectoral rates that we are seeing, because that's something unique of this crisis that I think deserves more attention. By the way, my results could also help explain a recent spike in consumer inflation expectations, which may be surprising because obviously we're experiencing a lot of collapse in output, a big recession. If you look at investors and others who follow inflation, everyone is predicting several months of deflation, and consumers are expecting the opposite. So there's a growing literature that actually documents how consumers tend to use their personal shopping experiences in the formation of inflation expectations. And I've done some work with on that front as well, but I'm listing several others that have contributed here. And you can see that clearly in the data. If you look at the Michigan Inflation Expectation Survey or the New York Fed, which produces its own statistics with its own survey, we see this big spike. And to a great extent, it must be because people are sort of feeling with their actual purchases that they are spending more money, particularly with food. And then more generally, I just want to end with this idea. If you look at the macro data, there seems to be an apparent puzzle in the macro data compared to previous crises, because clearly output has collapsed, which is what you have on the left, the GDP, relative to what we saw in the Great Recession. The collapse now, it's incredible. But inflation has remained relatively stable. It fell a lot more, and the deflationary period persisted longer, I would say, than in the 2008, 2009 crisis that we're seeing now. Now, there was a decline, but there was a very quick rebound. And in fact, if you use the statistics that I just showed you from this paper, inflation is even more resilient when we take into account these changes in consumption patterns. So what is different this time? I think it has a lot to do with the supply disruptions that are playing a far more important role here. So we definitely need more research to try to understand how this is affected even measured COVID inflation dynamics. And so it also connects a little bit to what Rachel was saying, all these unavailable goods, can we try to measure them? So I'm doing follow-up work for those who are interested on what's happening with stockouts levels in retailers we can see online over time, and trying to link those to supply disruptions and inflation patterns moving forward. So I'll end there, but happy to take any questions.
So thank you very much, Alberto. And there are, in fact, 4 questions in the queue. So I'll ask Emily, who's our host, to let the questioners speak. First question is from James Mitchell.
Hello. The BLS calculate variance estimates for the CPI based on its sampling variability. I wondered if the differences you show between your point estimates of COVID on normal times inflation are statistically different if you did account for this known data uncertainty.
So I think I haven't checked it. It's a good idea. Now, that is data uncertainty because you can actually not get the prices of the goods that are already in the basket with the traditional weights. I think I am trying to identify something that the BLS is not even trying to account for because they maintain the old basket. No? But I think it's a great point, and definitely there's a lot more uncertainty on many dimensions. There are unavailable goods, and the BLS had to immediately switch from doing the data collection offline to doing it online. So there are also potential biases about outlet differences that we should take into account. And I'm certainly haven't looked at those in detail yet. No? But I guess they are complementary. Most of them would suggest that we're missing some higher increase in costs of living along the lines of what this basket bias I have in the data shows.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I certainly agree with you that it's sort of the unknown uncertainties, perhaps not the known data uncertainties, that are particularly relevant right now. So, your research is a great step in that direction. Thank you.
Thanks very much, James. And the next question is from Anna, if Emily can unmute her.
So my question is the following: looking forward, so what is your advice for statistical offices? Should they be considered their baskets when computing CPI, or this is just a temporary change and you expected that these deviations would decline over time?
So I think it's a temporary effect on consumption patterns. But it sort of means, it depends on what you're trying to do with the statistic. If you're trying to ignore short-term trends and focus more on long-term patterns, maybe the Fed is more interested in that, then we wouldn't need to adjust the basket so fast. Now, if you're someone more concerned about short-term inflation dynamics, it would be good to have an index that adjusts the basket more frequently. And so I guess my advice would be for statistical agencies to start producing additional complementary indexes that adjust the basket faster. So the BLS actually produces a changed CPI that tries to take into account some of these. But I think the source of data limits their ability to do this, fast enough for the basket to incorporate these changes in baskets in periods like this, where the crisis is so severe and can change these patterns so much. No? But moving forward, I hope, and I've seen several statistical agencies, including the BLS, becoming a lot more interested in finding experimental indices or indices where the basket itself is updated more frequently.
He indicated some regulation issues too, but let me be quiet.
Right, but the UK has I think been a leader in this. I've seen this. There's an experimental index, and several researchers in the US have already started looking into this.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Sumit. I'll just check that he's still there. Emily,
Hi there.
Yeah, thanks.
Sorry about that. No, it was just more for a comment. Thank you so much for the presentation there. And it was just a point on international comparisons I found very interesting. And I suppose it was really reflecting my priors that I would have thought the biases that you showed would have actually been in the same direction for all countries. You think in terms of the charts you showed in the change in kind of consumption expenditure, the weights. I would imagine all countries would face a very similar kind of change there if you think about the effects of lockdown. And then it was the point you were making about how the inflation rates at a component level may have gone in different directions. So it was more to agree with your point, but it was also, I think it'd be really interesting to unpick, because I suppose my prior would have been your first batch of countries, but I'm very interested in the second ones and the kind of implications there where you've actually gone in a different direction, if you kind of take into account the COVID effect. And I think you spoke about Germany might have been quite specific to package holidays. And I'm guessing for each of those countries, there's quite specific country, whether it be treatments of certain commodities or a domestic inflation type shock in those individual countries. So it's just more for comment, but a really interesting piece of analysis.
No, that's great comment. And I think everything you've said is absolutely right. So by design, this, on the weights, I am assuming, and I've seen other papers in the literature sort of documenting similar patterns everywhere. So I think it's a fair assumption to make that consumption weights have changed in similar weights everywhere. There's a faster recovery in some places versus others, depending on the dynamics of the health crisis and the lockdown. And now these results themselves, I'm using them to emphasize the second point, which is that it depends on what happens with the sectoral components, no? And like you said, if you look at all the countries on top, the story is very similar. It's more food inflation and less weight on the deflation. Now, I picked Germany, but I could have picked any of these other countries, and they all have one sector that seems to be behaving in a way that is not consistent or very particular, perhaps to that country, no, and sort of doesn't produce the same higher COVID inflation results. They are all European, so that you see down there. So I also was trying to see if maybe there was something about the faster dynamics of the crisis in Europe, or but I think it's worth picking and looking in more detail.
Thank you. And one last question from Martin Wheel, if Emily, you would be kind enough to unmute.
Thank you very much for an absolutely fascinating paper. I mean, one of the things that worries me is that, are you essentially you're describing the changes in consumption patterns as a consequence of change in preferences. If we were to say and this follows on from Rachel's paper, if we were to say what changes in prices were needed to induce the changes in consumption patterns and use those latent prices, then we would get a rather different answer to your question, wouldn't we? Do you have any thoughts on how one might try and do that?
If I understood you correctly, I think it depends on whether we call these changes in preferences or not. It may be the case that at the beginning people were simply not able to consume in these sectors because of the lockdowns. But I think you're right that as these move forward and many of the lockdowns were restricted, in some countries weren't even forced to remain in place, it may be showing a change in preferences during during the pandemic, at least. No? We'll see if it's more permanent. Now, I missed, to be honest, Martin, the second part of your question. Can you rephrase it, if you don't mind?
Well, I suppose what I'm thinking is that if we were to say that the price, there's a latent price which reflects the actual price plus a notional tax, or the fear that people have of going to a pub in order to, they might catch COVID if they go to the pub, and the price of a pint of beer reflected that, then we'd get a rather different answer to what the inflation rate has been, and perhaps something a bit more like Rachel's answer. Right,
that is true. And in fact, you'll notice I haven't said much about welfare, because here, if we're starting to think about utility and welfare, there are other considerations like the one you're pointing out, that preferences may actually be changing, and this may not be something that is reducing welfare for several people. So I think there's a connection there. I haven't explored it in greater detail, because I think it's something that requires more of a theoretical analysis that I haven't done.
Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for those succinct answers to the various questions, Alberto. So I will now pass chair duties to Rachel, as per prior agreement, and I will find my and attempt to get this done on time. So I begin by mentioning my co-authors, David Bounie and Youssouf Camara from Telecom Paris. And I want to also thank the data providers. This data set, which I'm going to describe to you, is a very rich one. In some ways analogous to what Alberto was describing with the US credit and debit card data. They come from the Groupement des Cartes Bancaires CV and were provided essentially to David Bounie, and it's a real public service that the Groupement des Cartes Bancaires has provided. So just a quick overview. I want to describe some of the things that we think are very interesting that we're finding from these data beyond, of course, real-time monitoring of consumption, which I will mention to you very quickly. There's simply a lot of other things that we think we can find out about consumer mobility, about online on-site or point-of-sale substitution, and about consumer learning and possible hysteresis effects, which are going on as a result of these things. So I'll try to emphasize those things and then go through what some of the results are. So there are some of those questions. How were movements affected geographically and among retailers? What do we learn from the differential effects across different consumer sectors? Again, a point that Alberto was making, some of these, and I think also came into Rachel's talk, some of these sectors could be seen as essential, some as non-essential. That affected the shutdown restrictions, the containment restrictions in France. And we can learn different things by observing the different effects in these sectors. So we're going to look quickly at the degree to which consumers seem to have been able to mitigate these effects through a move to online purchases, which generally I think is interesting because it's an indicator that the online shopping channel is a way of making the economy more resilient to shocks of this type than it might otherwise have been. So we can study that effect. We can also observe some effects on interregional retail trade. So I say, I think there are a lot of things that we can learn from data of the type that I'm about to describe, quite apart from the real-time monitoring, which I think is also valuable. So the dates I'm not going to spend any time on. Roughly mid-March to mid-May is the critical time for the main body of the shutdown in France, which we're going to be studying, but you know about that. So the data set that we're using is a very rich one. So it comes from this agreement among financial institutions with over 100 financial institutions as members. There's very broad coverage across France. There are about 70 million cards in use, which is roughly the population of France. And there are nearly 2 million merchants associated with it. The expenditures cover almost 60% of household consumption expenditure. It is not universal coverage, I have to emphasize. For example, when a consumer goes to a shop where the merchant uses the same financial institution that the consumer does, the card and the merchant are from the same financial institution, then no interbank transfer takes place, and that does not show up in the data. Nonetheless, the coverage is very broad. There are about 10 billion transactions a year. And what I think is particularly important about this is that we're getting a card identifier, so we can identify a particular card as it moves from purchase to purchase. We don't have information about the individual. We have no demographic information. Confidentiality, of course, restricts that, but we can identify the particular card. We know the merchant. We know the precise geographical location of the merchant and therefore where the purchase was made. And therefore we can identify movements of the consumer between two purchasing locations. We have the category of expenditure. There's a fairly detailed division available in France. We have the value of the purchase and we have the exact time. So a lot can be deduced about consumer mobility from this. So in the present paper, we're taking about a little bit less than 5 billion individual transactions. We're comparing analogous periods in 2019 and 2020, and we're looking at the dates surrounding the pandemic containment to see what can be learned. So we'll first just look at some quick real-time monitoring. of the consumption dynamics. We have extended results, but this is just a quick point here. We're getting daily monitoring here through these data. So we're seeing in these up and down spikes the different patterns throughout the week that traditionally there has been less consumption on Sunday. The quick point that I would make in comparing these graphics is that we have value here and volume here. And whoops, I'm sorry, I have to go up. We see if we look closely that the volume dropped more than the value, reflecting an increase on average in value per transaction. So of course we can do this real-time monitoring throughout the period, and we'll see later some patterns of evolution. We can also monitor within the day by hour because of the time-specific stamps in these data. And one thing we begin to see here is in the comparison before the pandemic period, so roughly January, February, in the 2 years, 2019 and 2020, the 2 years were quite similar, quite stable. So that will appear across various indicators, and that will make it relatively easy for us to do a difference in difference model, which has some credibility in inferring the effects of the pandemic. When we compare the pandemic period, mid-March, the period of peak containment, let me say, in France, roughly speaking, mid-March through mid-May, we see not only the very substantial decline, which has been noted elsewhere, we also see a difference in the intraday pattern, which is interesting, that afternoon consumption expenditure is lower relative to morning. We may be observing, for example, fewer restaurant meals through the evening. In fact, we're seeing this relative to the previous period. Intra-week, similar thing. We're seeing throughout the weekly period, we're seeing the reduction in afternoon expenditures, and we're seeing an evolution in weekly patterns, whereas in the January-February period, both years, we see that the pattern is very similar. But let's get to some results which are beyond the actual monitoring, and which, as I say, I think are particularly interesting as indicators of consumer response and adaptation to the shock that they're undergoing. So because we have a precise timestamp in each transaction, we have an ordering of transactions for given consumers, and we have geographical locations, and that means we can compute distances between every transaction that a particular card makes. So we define for each card a home location, which is where the largest number of transactions takes place. So that's a de facto home. It's not a legal address of the card. It's the place where the person empirically was making the most transactions. France, as I'm sure you know, is divided into départements, or departments, I'll say from now on, roughly like counties, perhaps, in the United States or in the UK. And we have a home city or town as well, by this definition. So we're going to look at the ways in which distributions of consumer movements have changed. And again, time is short, so I'm kind of speaking quickly through this. I'll just show you the pictures. On the left-hand side, once again, we have the January and February results, and we see in each of these cases that 2019 and 2020 were very similar. It's just a tiny shift in the graphic between the 2 years in the pre-pandemic period. Afterwards, we see a very substantial shift. The scales are different on the graphs, of course. So this peak here for the 2019 graphic is actually about the same as over here. We see that there's a big shift in the distribution of consumer distances traveled toward low numbers. So we're seeing a substantial impact on consumer mobility, as one would have expected. And later on, I think in this presentation, we have results by month. We can see the evolution. Number of cities visited by individual cardholders. Again, in the pre-pandemic period, January, February, there's very little difference between the 2 years. Everything was evolving according to very, very slow patterns of change. During the pandemic containment period, mid-March through mid-May, we see once again a shift in the distribution toward very small numbers of cities visited. Same thing for proportion of value of consumption outside the home city. So here we're beginning to see a glimpse again of the interregional effects. The distribution has shifted towards much smaller proportions outside the home city. So trade among regions, in the sense of consumer retail trade, is greatly reduced. And that's going to have implications for regions of the country, which are particularly dependent on out-of-region consumers, tourist regions in particular. Number of retailers visited, also we see once again the distribution shifted downward quite a lot. So now I'm going to move to some model-based results in which we can get some numerical estimates of some of the things that are going on, which again I think is quite interesting. So we're going to look, again, time is short, just very, very quickly. I'll mention some difference in different specifications. We're essentially going to estimate differences between years given, sets of controls, fixed effects in a pre-containment period and a post-containment period. And what we would hope, as I hope the next screen is going to show, that if we're going to be able to draw valid inferences, we should see very small effects comparing the 2 years after the controls in the pre-pandemic period. So the January and February results would, we hope, not be substantially different. And the pandemic period results, mid-March through mid-May, will then be credible estimates of the degree to which different measures were affected by the pandemic and the containment. And this is going to tell us about the degree to which these containment restrictions were respected, the degree to which they had effects, and the differences across different sectors and things of this type will also tell us something interesting, I think, about consumer adaptation, particularly when we compare online and offline. So just some very quick results here on essentially reflecting what we saw earlier. The pre-containment periods for offline or point of sale expenditure, no significant difference. The containment period, there are very substantial differences. The volume of transactions affected more heavily than the value per transaction increasing. Online, and here's something that we'll see more of later, there are some very small effects in the pre-pandemic period as well. I'm not going to talk about announcement effects today because time is so short. Smaller effects in the containment period, but later we'll see that there's an evolution over time in these effects, and I think that will be especially interesting. So here, what we're doing essentially is plotting this coefficient, the post-containment coefficient, beta hat post, week by week throughout this period. Okay, and this is for point of sale transactions. So we're seeing that there's a very rapid decline and a small recovery. We're seeing that the value of transactions went up. For online transactions, what we see is, again, we see a rapid decline at first, but we see also a rapid recovery in the value of transactions. And of course, the value per transaction was higher here as well. And we're seeing over time that consumers were apparently learning about the possibility of online consumption. Presumably some consumers were very familiar with this in advance and some were not. And we're seeing a movement in the direction of learning about this over time and mitigating the effects of the containment. And the sectoral breakdown, I think, will be very interesting. So those are aggregate results. We're seeing there's a very substantial decline, obviously, during the period. We're seeing that the restrictions had a big impact on consumption. We saw that the online effect is smaller and that the online effect began to disappear and that online consumption, in fact, recovered. So what do we learn by considering the individual sector level? Well, I think we see evidence of the substitution relatively clearly. The data give us a precise code, as I said earlier, for the type of consumer expenditure, and that allows us to disaggregate results by essential and non-essential sectors. That's particularly important in France because the government mandated closure of non-essential businesses through this period, whereas essential businesses such as grocery stores and pharmacies could remain open. So that distinction is going to give us some potential insight into the way in which consumers could use online shopping for the non-essential sectors which were closed. So here are a few examples, first of all, from essential sectors, so that these stores remained open throughout the pandemic. The legal restrictions, the required closure, did not apply. And we see patterns that I think are quite comprehensible. First of all, I'll take them from the bottom. Pharmacies, essentially no effect on point of sale expenditures. You could still go to the pharmacy, nothing much was changed. Online expenditures went up, but that was a small proportion of the overall expenditures in advance. We have information on those proportions in the paper. Bakeries. Bakeries were deemed essential, but it might be that you would consider some goods you would get in bakeries to be less essential, let's say, than going to the grocery store. And we did see a substantial point of sale decline in expenditures at bakeries. Again, we saw, and these are overall results through the 2 months, an increase in online expenditures. Grocery stores, we saw, as has been the case in other data, such as those that Alberto showed earlier from the US credit and debit card data, we see increases in grocery store expenditures. And that is reflecting also the fact that restaurants are closed and there's substitution in the direction of buying food rather than having food prepared. Non-essential sectors. We see that the point of sale expenditures in most of these non-essential sectors essentially collapsed. A -1 essentially means expenditure has dried up. These stores were almost all closed. Total expenditures declined rapidly also, but what we see is that in these sectors, we're seeing relatively large increases in online expenditures. And the pattern, again, is that that tended to pick up over time. So that there is some mitigation of the losses in consumption expenditure that could take place through point of sale. That takes place to a differential degree across these sectors, but there are large increases in the online expenditure. And to some extent also, I think looking at these, one is inclined to think that the degree to which a good is generic or the degree to which we can identify that a good will meet our needs through online descriptions appears to be correlated with, and again, one can see that in the larger set of results in the paper, appears to be correlated with the degree of online increase. So you can imagine it might be relatively difficult to get shoes that are going to fit well online. But if you know what appliances you want, it's not a particular problem to order it and have it delivered. And we see big differences in the way that consumers responded across these sectors to mitigate the effect on their ability to get access to goods caused by the pandemic restrictions. So again, I want to emphasize that, you know, we're seeing indications here, I think, not only of consumer expenditure, consumer substitution, excuse me, of one channel from the other, but we're also seeing indications as we track the data through the weeks, which there's limited time to do. As we track the data through the weeks, we're seeing evidence of consumer learning, and that may, as time evolves, be reflected in the fact that consumers who have had to undertake learning about online shopping may change their behavior permanently. So we may see hysteresis effects here, in that in the months following the pandemic containment, or in the years following, we may see that point of sale expenditures take a permanently lower proportion of expenditures, and that the learning about online shopping that has taken place may permanently change the relative importance of retail outlets. So finally, I want to look, I'm out of time. I'm just going to go through these results very quickly. Some interregional consumer trade effects. We measure them, again, comparing the 2 years. We see the evolution of point of sale expenditures by consumers from one region in another region. So here we are tracking expenditures that people made in regions outside the home region. Before I go on, I'll ask Rachel as host if you could tell me if there are any questions, and if so, I'll wrap up pretty quickly, and if not, I'll go on for a minute or two.
There are no questions at this moment, but I'm
okay.
checking the chat thing.
Okay, thanks. So I'll just go on for another moment. So we're seeing that the point of sale expenditures by consumers outside their home regions declined very substantially in March, essentially dried up in April, and in May, throughout the period that's relevant, began to increase a little bit. I see there is a question now, it's appearing on my screen. So I'll wrap up before too long. But we can track these effects on regional economies of consumers being shut out. Clearly, some regions are more dependent than others on consumers from outside the region making consumer purchases. And so we would expect there are going to be differential effects on regional GDP. So I guess I just said that. And now I'll just go through some very quick answers to the questions that I posed at the beginning. So these detailed transaction data are obviously valuable in real-time monitoring. We can also learn all sorts of other things that we think are interesting about response of the economy to extreme events, about consumer adaptation, about mobility, about interregional effects. So how were consumers' movements affected? Well, they were reduced very heavily by all measures, indicating a high degree of compliance with the containment restrictions, particularly after an initial period in which consumers were expected to move home. What were the differential effects across consumer sectors? Well, we've been through that. Smaller point of sale effects in essential sectors, dramatic reductions in non-essential sectors, and once again, the suggestion that containment restrictions were well respected. Mitigation, clearly, not only did it take place, but it ramped up through the period as consumers learned how to replace the purchases they would have made in non-essential sectors through the online channel. And that learning may have permanent effects, which we can investigate at some other time. What effects do we observe on interregional trade? Well, declined dramatically during the peak containment. And once again, there was an evolution over time, which we can track and can continue to track as time goes on. So thank you very much. I'm going to wrap up, stop sharing for now, and take any questions that anyone might have. I'm afraid I saw something in the Q&A, but I can't at the moment pick it up.
So Liam Leiden asked a question, but let me see if I can figure out how to unmute them. I'm sorry.
Oh, so can you hear me now, Rachel? Can you hear me, John?
Yes.
Yes,
sorry.
thank you.
Okay. Hi, John. This is Ray Leiden from the Central Bank of Ireland.
Thank you.
Very interesting talk. I get the sense you're only beginning to scratch the surface here. The first part where you talk about monitoring, lots of central banks are doing that as well with that sort of data. We're doing it as well also with card spending data. But your geography and the distance analysis got me thinking. Have you thought about trying to analyze the impact of work from home on cities? So a lot of the narrative we've heard, for example, about London recently and also Dublin is these are cities where you've got a lot of inward commuting. And because that's not happening, you've got a big fall in spending. So have you thought about using the data to look into that, you know, where a lot of the daily economic activity has disappeared? And a second question related to that as well, also on the geography, is I don't know if you've seen Vasco Carvalho's ESCoE presentation at a webinar in July, but he has data quite like yours, but he also relates it to the income levels in certain regions, which would be quite interesting. You could extend it to the département in France, right? So it would be a very interesting analysis. Do you see very different adjustments for higher or lower income regions, that sort of thing? I think that would be really fascinating.
Yes, thank you. Those are very good points. You're absolutely right. So yes, I have seen the Cavallo paper, not the presentation. So to take your first point, so the global answer is yes, we've thought about those things and haven't done anything, and you're quite right. There's just a lot to do here, and we have a couple of other papers, in fact, on the go using these data, but this is sort of the priority thing. The work from home effect is potentially very interesting and important. It's also possible that over time, it will disappear because people wish for the human interaction of offices. So I suspect that this is something where, although again, there will likely be hysteresis effects, there'll be permanent changes, they may be evolving and fading through time and may stabilize at a somewhat lower level than we're seeing at present. And we may, to some degree, be able to detect those through the purchasing patterns between large cities and regions. So you're absolutely right, and I think it'll be a very interesting thing to study over time. We haven't done so yet. The income question, we've got a few results on where, you see, one limitation of our data set imposed by confidentiality is that, you know, to some extent we can make deductions about income from different regions of the country. That's correct. We've tried other ways of making deductions about income at an individual level because we don't have the identity of individuals. We've tried to make deductions about this, for example, by the pattern of purchase. So, for example, as Alberto was mentioning earlier, lower income people spend a higher proportion of their income on groceries, for example. So we may be able to deduce something about the expenditure, about the income levels of individual cardholders here, whose identities we don't know, from the patterns of expenditure they have. So that is one thing that we've tried to do. I can't say that it was very easy to do, I must say. It's possible that, well, not just possible, some people will have multiple cards and they might use one of them for travel and one of them for buying groceries. And so it's a very imperfect match and it's very difficult to do. But those are very good points, and we have thought about it. And by the way, because the data sets differ very much from country to country, I'd be very interested to know about anything that you or anyone else here might be doing on data from Ireland in your case or anywhere else. The degree to which data are available of this type differs a great deal across countries. I'm going to be very interested to hear about anything that anybody else has obtained or is working on. My email is easy to find. So thank you very much for those comments.
All right. Thanks, John. Thank you. We'll definitely get in touch by email. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel.
I think we're pretty well out of time in any event, Rachel. So I'll just thank everyone for coming to all of the sessions. I'm sure that I speak for the other presenters as well, and that if anyone has any comments that they would like to make, our email addresses, I'm sure, are straightforward to find online. Rachel, as a US government employee, that may be less clear in your case, but perhaps you could tell everyone your email address in case they wish to get a hold of you.
My email address is also publicly available. It's just rachel.soloveichik@bea.gov. And if you Google my name, you'll come up with BEA's researcher page. And I'd appreciate any comments people can give, that this is going to be posted as a BEA working paper soon. So I'd like to, make sure it's as good as it possibly can.
Thank you. And yes, of course, I also would very much welcome any comments or thoughts that people have. So we're just about to have time closed out on us, so I guess we should just say goodbye. Thank you again all for coming, and I'm sure we'll all be very interested to hear about each other's work after the fact. Thank you.